Well, good afternoon. My name is Lynn Sutton, and I am Dean of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library here at Wake Forest University, and it is my privilege to serve as your host for this symposium, Single Threads Unbraided, for the next 2 days. We have been working for about 18 months on this program, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to the celebration of the works of A.R. Hammonds. In particular, I'd like to thank President Nathan Hatch, who will say a few words in a moment, and whose presence personally demonstrates the respect that the university has for one of its most notable sons. I would like to thank and recognize Mrs. Phyllis Hammonds and her son John, who have come a great distance, and in particular for being so gracious in responding to all the requests for permissions and assistance for the symposium. Thank you very much. I would like to recognize I would also like to recognize Archie's sister, Vida Cox, who traveled from the eastern part of the state at considerable effort to be here, and is joined by her 3 fine sons, Jeffrey, John, and Alan. I did not know Archie Hammonds. I did not have that chance, and I wish I had. I do know that many, if not most of you in the audience, did know him and have come here because of that. I could recognize probably 2/3 of this crowd for everyone who had a special reason for coming, a special tie to Archie and his work. To a person, all of the distinguished speakers are here out of love and respect for the man. I can't tell you the number of people who called or wrote to me as we planned this symposium to say how much they wanted to come because Archie was their inspiration, because they read Archie's poetry every day, because they still keep a copy of his poems in their car, just so it will always be near. So what is it about Archie Hammonds that nearly 10 years after his death, people feel such a personal attachment to him and to his work? Some of the best literary critics in the world will speak to us in the next 2 days to help answer that question. But first, just a little background for those of you who may not be so familiar. An Eastern North Carolina native, he was a returning World War II veteran going to college on the GI Bill, graduating on the old campus of Wake Forest in 1949 with a degree in biology. And yet, it was in those undergraduate years studying science that his interest in poetry was awakened, and he determined to be a poet. And what a poet he was. He published 24 books and earned numerous awards, including 2 National Book Awards, the Frost Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Service to American Poetry, Yale University's Bollingen Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, a Lannan Literary Award for Poetry, and the Tanning Prize. In 1981, he was in the first group to receive the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award Fellowship. In 1990, he was inducted into the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. In 2001, Archie Hammonds died in Ithaca, New York. Hammonds is best known for his poetry, and yet his genius did not stop with the printed word. The power of his expression spilled over onto the canvas with great delight. You see here 20 of the 20 paintings that will be featured this afternoon, just to give you a little taste. It seems he wanted us to know ever more of the world he saw, the world in which he lived. So he wrote us words and painted us pictures and left it to us to find their meaning, which will be our task for the next 2 days. I would like to call attention to certain events in the program. After our session here at 4 o'clock, we will walk to the building next door, which is the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, where Provost Jill Tiefenthaler will officially accept these paintings on behalf of the university. At the reception, copies of the new edition of the North Carolina poems will be for sale, as well as copies of Mules and select publications of our symposium speakers. At 5:30, those of you who paid for dinner or are guests will be in the Scales Fine Arts Center at a dinner honoring North Carolina poets. At 7:30, the world premiere of Here to Become Forever will take place in the Ring Theater in Scales. This one-act play has been adapted by local actor Michael Huey from a collection of letters written by Archie to the love of his life, Phyllis Blumbo, in the late 1940s. Tomorrow morning, our sessions will lead off with a discussion of these gorgeous paintings that will be unveiled this afternoon. And to conclude the symposium, we will feature a fun poetry burst at noon. Over a light lunch, Wake Forest students and friends will read their favorite Hammonds poems, popping up one after another, leaving time for discussion and delight. At this time, I would like to thank and embarrass the committee that has put all of this together. The symposium really was the brainchild of Emily Herring Wilson, and I know she is known to many, if not most of you in this audience. Emily is standing at the back. I call her our symposium muse, as she inspired us all with her memories of Archie and a relentless stream of new ideas on how to honor him. Joining Emily and I on the committee are, and if you would stand and stay standing, please, Heather Childress, Art Collections; Brooke Davis, Theater and Dance; Craig Fansler, Z. Smith Reynolds Library; Elizabeth Skinner, Forsyth County Public Library; Chris Tumanello, undergraduate student; Eric Wilson, English Department; and Giz Womack, Z. Smith Reynolds Library. This symposium was funded by a number of sources, from Wake Forest University, the Provost Fund for Academic Excellence, the English Department, and the Z. Smith Reynolds Library. In addition, the project was made possible in part by a grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council, a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I believe we have Shelley Crisp in the audience, the executive director, who is here today and may speak to us at the reception. One little bit of housekeeping. Because it has already started raining, the parking lot that you use today has been closed for tomorrow. So if you come back tomorrow, you may park in Lot A, which is our backup lot, which is next to Waite Chapel. I hope that won't be an inconvenience. Also, if you are staying at Grayland, there is a shuttle that is running back to Grayland after the reception. It will leave from the front of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library at 5 o'clock. And if you stay for the play tonight, there will be another shuttle returning at 9 o'clock. Now, it is my privilege to present Nathan O. Hatch, who became Wake Forest University's 13th president in July 2005. He had previously served as provost at the University of Notre Dame, where he was the Andrew B. Tax Professor of History. His first years at the helm here at Wake Forest were characterized by an intense period of getting to know the university, its faculty, students, and alumni. In order to identify both opportunities and challenges, Dr. Hatch completed a comprehensive strategic planning process to guide Wake Forest's future. Additionally, Dr. Hatch embarked on a master planning process to ensure that the physical development of the campus was aligned with the university's strategic goals. 1 month ago, Dr. Hatch announced the launch of the Humanities Institute to support innovative scholarships and collaboration in the humanities, including symposia such as this one. Dr. Hatch.
Thank you, Lynn. Good afternoon and welcome to Wake Forest. A.R. Hammonds is truly one of Wake Forest's most notable alumni. He was a poet and, as you heard, twice winner of the National Book Award. And he may have been as good a painter as he was a poet. 10 years after his death, he has loyal a following as ever, as evidenced by the enthusiastic response to this symposium. A son of North Carolina, 1949 graduate of this university, and the recipient of an honorary degree here in 1973. We claim him as our own, but his creativity and his imagination has touched a world far beyond this campus. To all of our guests, including family, friends, and colleagues of Archie Hammonds, welcome to Wake Forest University. A special welcome to Phyllis Hammonds, Archie's wife, and to other members of the family who we're delighted to have with us. I hope those of you who do not know Wake Forest will have a chance to gain some understanding of this place, where we celebrate the liberal arts as a foundation of learning, and where our commitment to the humanities is deeply woven into our DNA. The timing of this symposium, celebrating the life and work of Archie Hammonds, could not be more perfect. It was only last month, as Lynn has said, that I joined the faculty and other colleagues from around the university as we celebrated the establishment of the new Wake Forest Humanities Institute, a collaborative effort in research and teaching, signaling Wake Forest's newest commitment to our motto, Pro Humanitate. I think Archie would have approved. The power of the humanities is that it helps us understand ourselves by understanding others. Archie Hammonds achieved that through his poetry, his painting, and his letters. He was the essence of a humanist. This symposium honors not only the life and work of Archie Hammonds, but also all of you who are here because of your own love and belief in the power of creative expression. I want to acknowledge today the work of Lynn Sutton, the Dean of the Smith's Library, and her staff who had put so much effort into the organization of the symposium. And to Emily Wilson, who proposed the idea of this event to Lynn over a year and a half ago, and who has donated to the library a set of Archie Hammonds' original watercolors where they will have a permanent home in our library. Emily, we are the grateful and proud recipients of this wonderful gift and will treasure them as part of the remarkable legacy of Archie Hammonds. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker. Helen Vindler is the A. Kingsley Porter University Professor at Harvard University. She is one of the leading poetry critics in the United States and is the author of several hundred articles and books. In addition to her long career teaching both graduate and undergraduate students, some of them who have been in her famous core course to introduce non-English majors to poetry. What a gift. Vindler has written of Hammonds, he is not afraid to represent the human presence as it actually occurred in the universe, not at the center, but at the edge of its galaxy, which itself is one temporary and random point in a very long historical continuum. He not only sees our existence in that light, he feels it to be so. Dr. Vindler, you honor us with your presence today. Welcome and thank you.
Hello. Let me say how happy I am to be here, as I have been before, and what a privilege it is to be able to talk again about Archie Hammonds. You know, when I wrote this talk, I was calling him Archie, and then I realized that's not quite right. So I went back to Hammonds. But I was so happy to have known him. He's a great poet whose fame will only spread. His shyness in his own life, his reclusiveness, meant that he wasn't barnstorming around the United States, making himself known as other poets had done. But his fame began to grow and then has never stopped growing since. I'm talking about his last book with the rather absurd title Bosh and Flapdoodle, a book I didn't know what to make of when I first saw it because it was so different from that galactic Archie that you heard President Hatch just mention. This is, in many ways, an unnerving book. Bosh and Flapdoodle, A.R. Hammonds' last book, composed in 1996 but not published until 2005, startled me when I first read it. It was so flagrantly down to earth in its picture of male old age, so candid in its account of bodily debility and impotence, so unafraid of self-exposure, so familiar in its vocabulary, so densely populated with other people. In short, unlike the earlier books presenting the poet as a solitary, as an inhabitant of deserts, or as the lone watcher of the skies. and it also differs defiantly from those books which are dense with polysyllables and conceptual abstractions. It was not that Hammonds had not investigated ordinary life before, or mental and physical suffering as he does here, or a popular vocabulary. He certainly had treated those various subjects, not only in the earlier North Carolina poems such as those about Nellie Myers or Silver his mule or Sparkle his pig, but also, more seriously perhaps, in the snow poems, in Easter Morning, and memorably in Glare, with the heartbreaking portrait of the death of his baby brother and of his mother's grief. Still, he's been chiefly celebrated by me, among others, as the first American poet to present with full ease the vocabulary, both conceptual and practical, of modern scientific materialism. Hammonds knew all about the motions of the universe: astronomical, planetary, geological, vegetative, optical, climatic, oceanic, seasonal. And on those models of those motions, he founded the motions of his poetry. Hammonds was the first American poet, so far as I know, to declare these motions the central topic of his poetics. Poems, he argued in interviews, essays, and poems. Poems themselves are always in motion, evolving en route from their beginning to their end. The motions traced during that evolution produced the structure of his resulting poems. Poems, he said, were fixed things, and yet they were in flow. Poems were flowing things, and yet they became those inalterable, fixed, crystalline lattices on the page. For those of us who wanted, I'm still revising, for those of us who wanted a poetics concerned not only with the standard items of theme, imagery, rhythm, and diction, we wanted a poetics emphasizing the inner mobility of the lyric form, that his poems, the mobility of the lyric form. In that, his poems satisfied a profound intellectual need. Of course, they satisfied a profound emotional need, too, the need to see our lives in a wider context satisfied in earlier centuries by philosophy or religion. Hammonds understood from his religious upbringing exactly which needs of the heart were satisfied by the perception of a larger environment within which human life could be contemplated. Yet, as he declared, he determined to bypass the two earlier Western conceptions of that larger environment, the Judeo-Christian one in which he had been raised, and the perennial mythology of the classical age. He chose to substitute for these two grand conceptions the grand environment of the cosmos. Appalled at first by the silence of the infinite spaces, Hammonds went through the universe calling for answers from the wind or the mountains, and making up transparent allegorical narratives of his dialogues with the high contours of the universe. And especially in the long poems of a more philosophical and abstract orientation, such as Hibernaculum or Sphere, we heard Hammonds proposing in stanzas of 4 or 3 lines the theories of our human motions and their analogic relation to the motions of the universe. I'm running over, so I'm skipping the illustration from Sphere, which you can all read later, which is the abstracted conceptual Archie. And therefore, as we come to the pages of Bosch and Flapdoodle, where the cosmic Hammonds is in abeyance, and the familial and fraternal and personal Hammonds dominates, we rear back in delighted but almost dismayed surprise. Here Hammonds tethers his abstractions, when they appear, to a particular man in old age, fearing illness, disability, and death. And here he substitutes for his conceptual cosmic vocabulary a vocabulary of sensation and local observation. Our surprise arises not only from the frequent and irrepressible comic tone of this portrait of diminished old age, but surprise also attends upon the poet's diction. Not only is his discourse especially conversational, as it has been sometimes before, but it's also, in one of its reaches, and this is what surprised me at first, eminently tautologous, And as I've said in my title, I'm sorry, did I announce the title? It's in your handout. Minimalism, the most words for the least. The handout is in your program. You've all seen it, I hope. What asks the diminished Hammonds in his closing poem, Way Down Upon the Woodsy Roads, what are the most words for the least? We have long been accustomed to the least words for the most, to a spare form of modern minimalist lyric with great ambitions, introduced by Pound, Williams, and imported haiku. But what is one to make of a lyric that minimizes its vocabulary to the fewest possible words and then uses them over and over and over again? In Bosch and Flapdoodle, not incidentally, the quatrains and tercets of the earlier poems of the past have disappeared. Almost every poem presents itself in separated couplets, the least of the stanza forms. To illustrate Hammonds' maximal minimalism, I begin with one of its most outrageous examples, the poem called A Few Acres of Shiny Water. That is what Hammonds dreamed of possessing, thought it would be the best thing to possess, your own lake. Like most of the poems in Bosch and Flapdoodle, it needs to be quoted entire to convey its full effect. These are very cunningly constructed poems. They need themselves as a whole to make their point. You have this with you, a few acres of shiny water. I guess anything gets old. Being rich, yep, pretty soon it's old. Occasional pleasant spurts of realization, then celebrity, a big ox in your way wherever you turn, that gets old. Having nothing to do gets old in a hurry. Going from having something to do to not being able to find anything to do, I'll say. Being in love, oh dear, even that, about the third month gets old, all those re-arisings. On the bestseller list, great the first week, also the second week, then it's every week. Expected, tedious, getting old. Market up, wow. Up again, oh boy, still up, and up. I see, okay. Really, you were finally thought to be as good a poet as you thought. So what? What is a poet? Even getting old gets old. The novelty aches and pains, surprising and scary at first, they don't wear off, but the novelty does. Finding and trying to find something new gets old. Find a new risk to take, a new cliff to sail off from. Pretty soon it's a drag to get all the way to Nepal or a Filipino trench, his service. Telling about getting old and everything getting old gets old, I'll tell you, it sure does. In his 12 instances of the phrase to get old in 25, or to be old in 25 lines, Hammonds runs through several variants of the verb, as you've seen. And besides this repetition of his central plight, getting old, there are in the poem several subclasses of repetition. Thing appears in all its variations. Anything, nothing, something, anything, something, and finally, of course, everything. Then there are the persistent interrupting interjections of the tale-teller to his imputed audience. Yep, pretty soon, I'll say, oh dear, wow, oh boy, I see. Okay, really? So what? Pretty soon, I'll tell you, it sure does. The tale-teller inevitably comes back to the repetitions of his impoverished quanta bursts of sameness. First, more sameness. First, the word being rich and being old and not being able to find anything, being in love, not being able to find anything again. Second, the word find, not being able to find anything, finding and trying to find a new risk. Thirdly, the word weak, as you've seen, and then there appears an epigram offering that same verb. You are finally thought to be as good a poet as you thought. The whole of that epigram curling around the repeated thought like a Möbius strip. The epigram is rapidly followed by the most minimal degree of repetition. One is very happy to see it finally get to ground zero. So what? You can't, that's the next level up. Repeating just one word twice, so would, but if you add on what, it makes a point of the point. Finally, the quintessential hopelessness of experiencing anything novel in old age sprouts at the end of the poem into the twice-repeated word novelty and the thrice-repeated new. The inevitable tautology of tedium closes the poem. Not only even getting old gets old, but also about telling about getting old, and everything getting old gets old, I'll tell you. The form of the phrasing in which the word tell brackets the successive variations of getting old, tell, getting old, gets old, tell, shows the poet wrapping up the last possible conclusion about the repetitive speech atrophy of old age. Tedium itself, named in the central statement of the poem, that every aspect of life now is expected, tedious, getting old, has been both stated and performed by a maximal repetitiveness of few words. On the other hand, a poem so ingeniously articulating the interweavings of its basic English cannot possibly itself be tedious in the reading. A life in which everything seems expected, tedious, getting old, menaces the imagination itself. As the poet Riley says in backburnered, that lovely verb, I have been backburnered. I'm soaring today like a dead mole. I have as much get up and go as a rock bottom. But even while standing in the poverty of verbal detritus, a phrase here, a phrase there, he tells us he remains thrifty, and even in experiencing impotence, he comically clings to the flaccid virtual penis and its latent possibility of potency. Phrases come to me. I think, what can I do with this? Into the trash? A possibility, but I'm a saver. I hold on. Having something to hold on to for an old man, even if it's like a turkey snood or slack elet, is better than a smooth cutoff of things. We must not leave the hapless, helpless, hopeless. Who knows when the most beautiful morning will appear for sure. What an image inventor Hammonds is, we think, as he bests Yeats's image of the slack penis as the first indicator of death. Hammonds imagines it first as a turkey snood, and then, as if that is not grotesque enough, a slack elet, both in identical iambs. So they match. Nonetheless, the images match. Nonetheless, a moment later, happy in finding a thrifty triple phrase, he personifies poetry as charity to the triply disabled. We must not leave the hapless, helpless, hopeless. It's funny that had never been said before. It suggests itself so immediately as being plucked out of the air as already existing, hapless, helpless, hopeless. And who are the hapless, helpless, hopeless at this moment for Bosch and Flapdoodle? The despairing old, especially the old men who used to draw their identity from their social function. What are they to do now, the hapless, helpless, hopeless, now that they have become useless? The next poem I'm coming to. The minimal import of the word useless is maximized in the poem called Get Over It, a poem voicing Hammonds' mock rebuttal of the social premise that old men, possessing no economical or biological reserves, are good for nothing. The poet takes up with superb self-irony the challenge of finding something that impotent, slow, jobless, and homeless men are good for, some social use of their uselessness. The world certainly says that they're good for nothing, but even as the poet appears to rebut the world by instancing things that old men are good for, he also apologetically asserts that even if they're good for nothing, they're wonderfully inexpensive. I love this poem. I guess old men aren't really good for nothing. They can cuddle, shuffle. You notice the verbs belong together, to cuddle, shuffle. They can cuddle, shuffle, and look about for where it all went. Harmless, they're attractive, gently innocent on park benches or subways or on the slow side of streets. Women are reassured by them. They are witnesses without danger, guardian angels. Out of the game, earnings free, they are what they earned before. They hardly compete at all. Their toothless mouths need no upkeep, no reconstructions, no root canals or extraordinary measures. Doesn't matter if their piss-burnt pants stiffen up, or if they seldom shave or use much hot water. They're wonderfully inexpensive. Yes, says the social world, but even if we don't have to fix their teeth or buy them new clothes, they certainly bring trouble once they're sick. Wonderfully inexpensive, yes, unless. And the poem takes up a new challenge, excusing the old men even if something does go wrong. They still aren't much trouble in older age, hiding out now, removing themselves from the slow side of streets to hang out in corners or in alleys. Unless, of course, they're wonderfully inexpensive, unless, of course, something goes wrong. They just hang out on corners or in alleys, useless, apologetic, inexcusable, supernumerary, invisible among the seeing. What good is a mess of stuff on its way out? Nearly out. Get on out, you might say. You're taking up room. At this point, we might stop to notice the poem's inexorable incremental adjectives in IN. First, the old men are innocent, then inexpensive, then inexcusable, and finally invisible. Each of these words has its own sound contour as the poet varies their accented syllables and their syllable count while keeping sonic resemblances that link them together. The wonderful suite of adjectives, useless, apologetic, inexcusable, supernumerary, rises etymologically to a classical stoicism. Autor, apo, logos, in, ex, causa, super, numerus. But Hammonds insists that such polysyllabic words must now coexist with piss and pants and stuff without seeming fancy. One of the satisfactions of reading such a poem is seeing, in the desperately minimal environment of the useless, the maximal resources of our grandest Greco-Latin roots brought into play. It's although the poem, with those Latin words, has become a form of bas-relief. On the minimal background stand out the maximal, classical-derived words. Hammonds announces that he is writing in this volume what he'll later define in a poem further on as prosody. I'm skipping the next excerpt. Hammonds is momentarily daunted in his repudiation of conventional rhyme and regular meter by remembering that Shakespeare distinguished metrical poetry from prose in the play, so he must have thought poetry was metrical. But Hammonds, recovering, affirms the essentially poetic nature of his hybrid prosody, insisting that tradition must be incorporated into the new unrhymed rhythms of contemporary verse. It's the reverse, you'll see, of what Eliot said when he said when a new thing enters the tradition, the whole tradition rearranges itself around the new poem. Archie puts it differently, as you'll see. Poetry, metrical, and sometimes rhymed. So poetry, I am to think, is at least mechanically metrical. But on the chance the tidal rhythm, which is the kind I write, prosody, can be allowed, I make a new word for it. Probably not new. Prosody, though, is a word for the groundlings, who are probably incapable of a perception, not a definition. I expect the sensitive and listening to hear the music in prosody and be able to pick out the poetry and then see that it prevails over all. Or else what is intelligence for? All that is music from the past must be kept, and all that is sound given up. And new sound must ever so subtly inform the old music, the deep silent dynamics, and hold us safely in the arms of our fathers as we hold our children in our arms. Now, in contra Eliot, it is not old sound that is informed by the new, but new sound that is informed by the old music. Although Hammonds signs off from this manifesto with a comic fear of his audience's possible reaction, please let's not hear anything more about prosody. He has still felt it necessary to define and defend his present style, which, although minimalist, is not minimal by brevity in the way his former short poems, which he called punningly briefings, were. Although in his closing poem, he permits his audience a further querulous objection. Don't you think poetry should be succinct? He answers with an amusing Latinate coinage justifying his maximal minimalism. Don't you think poetry should be succinct? Not now. I think it should be distinct. It should wander off and lose its way back and then bump into a sign and have to walk home. Both words, the real succinct and the coined distinct, come from kingere, to gird, so that if succinct means something girded up from below, binding itself into concision, distinct means contrastively a style unbound, unloosed. I do not, he says, the next quote, I do not believe that setting words to rhyme and meter turns prose into poetry. And having written some of the shortest poems, I now like to write around largely into any precinct, not succinct. So it is prosody that we are encountering in Bosch and Flapdoodle, and more often than not, Hammonds' aim is to rework one of the standard genres of lyric in his new people-oriented, colloquial, loquacious, funny distinctness. In the case I'm about to cite, the topic is perfect for maximalizing minimizing, namely maximizing the minima of dieting, the process of slimming indefinitely prolonging itself. The ancient genre being vivaciously revised is that of the didactic poem, the preacherly sermon, this time focused on the deadly sin of eating real food, although the irresistible temptation to that vice shines through, maximally, in the form of butter, ice cream, and delightful cheese. The mocking title, America, implies that the whole country is always universally dieting. The didactic poet gives nutritionist advice. Eat anything, but hardly any. Calories are calories. Olive oil, chocolate, nuts, raisins, but don't be deceived about carbohydrates and fruits. Eat enough and they'll make you as slick as butter. Or really excellent cheese, say Parmesan. How delightful. But you may eat as much of nothing as you please. Believe me, iceberg lettuce, celery stalks, sugarless bran. Watch carrots, they quickly turn to sugar. You cannot get away with anything. Eat it and it's in you, so don't eat it. And don't think you can eat it and wear it off running or climbing. If you refuse the peanut butter and sunflower butter, and you could sit on your butt all day and lose weight. Down a few ounces of heavyweight ice cream and sweat your balls, if pertaining, off for hours, to no, I say, no avail. So eat lots of nothing, but little of anything. An occasional piece of chocolate cake will be all right. Why worry? Once again, Hammonds is up to his repetition with variation, his prosody sameness. Eat anything, but hardly any. Eat enough. Eat as much of nothing as you please. You cannot get away with anything. Eat it, so don't eat it. Don't think you can eat it. Eat lots of nothing, but little of anything. The obsessiveness of dieting takes over the injunctions. Eat, don't eat lots, eat little. In any case, you are damned to the same fixation on food. We see and recognize and laugh and flinch. We may say of this maximal minimal merry-go-round, haven't we seen this tactic before in this volume? Well, yes, but we haven't seen it suddenly turn sharp and violent as it does when America continues. After the dieter's deluded, self-excusing, and occasional piece of chocolate cake will be all right, nature drives in like Zeus, charioted by wildfire causing lightning. The wind picks up the fire, prairies are fire-scythed, rivers of fire push clear through the hardwoods, as the punitively restrictive vocabulary of dieting is itself windswept away, and the exhilarating destructive energy of natural process renews the poet's diction. Lightning-lit, windswept fire lines scythed the prairies and strung rivers of clearing through the hardwoods. In these invigorating lines, the maximal tedium and minimal meanness of dieting are vanquished with a burst of the old Hammonds, the Ezra who was intimate with those fierce natural forces of wind and fire, about which there was nothing minimal at all. A nostalgia for native strength whips up rebellion against the nutritionists' prescriptive deprivations. We have so far seen in succession two American styles, the minimal style of dieting and the cosmic style of unpredictable lightning and wildfire. Those two have crashed up against each other, and we wonder which will win, the minimal or the cosmic. In a final burst of invention, as vegetation renews itself after the disaster of fire, Hammonds brings in a surprising but immemorial third thing, a new, humbler version of the cosmic, the large but non-violent actions of shining and steadfastness on the part of the other big light besides lightning, the generative sun. Disaster renewal, smallish weeds and bushes getting their seeds out, grazing attracting rabbits of buffalo, the other big light shining in steady. Hammonds' old age attraction to appropriately diminished versions of the cosmic has appeared in the opening poem of Bosch and Flapdoodle, called Fasting, in which, as he says, Halloween needs what we have today, a stir, ghostly stir. Not a gale so constant and high, but gusts. He often brings things together by that initial same sound. Not a gale, but gusts. Not a gale so constant and high, but gusts that show up out of nowhere. Presences that are not there. Little twists. I'm reading with eye drops. I apologize. Presences that are not there. Little twirls of leaves that scoot across the street and then just wilt out. Forms, air whirls that are made out of nothing, but that touch your face or rustle into the bushes, whispering and hissing. This spectral stir, says the poet, is motion. And this is the beautiful ending of the first poem, which leads us into the rest of the volume. The stir is motion, the closest cousin to spirit, and spirit the closest cousin to the other world, haunted with possibility, hope, anguish, and alarm. This beautiful close enumerates, this time without mockery, the mixed emotions undergone in the apprehension of death. Possibility, hope, anguish, and alarm. It warns us that under all the jokes in Bosch and Flapdoodle there lies the stratum of the tragic, its anguish, its alarm. We carry this prelude with us as we read the rest of the poems. Although Hammonds outfits his ridiculously titled book with an equally ridiculous array of subtitles, too long to quote entire, but including Oil Ode, Suet Pudding, Spotted Dick, Dumb Clucks, Pudding Bush Sopping Wet, Spew, and Shitface, he is more candid here about his lifelong nervousness and terror than in any other of his works. In focal lengths, that depends on how far the lens is away from concentrating the light. In focal lengths, the next poem, he characterizes his jokes as only the obverse of his inner torment, his inner volcano. And he gives us a shocking life narrative of the awful burn center within his being, his hatred of it, enumerating his hatred of it, his jeering at it, this burn center, his attempts to destroy it, its inseparability from his verbal self and his poems, his disgust at it, his anger that people come to warm themselves at his bristled nest of humiliations, his internal hell, treating it by observing it from various focal lengths in order to chart its being. The poem ends in a brilliant minimalist farrago of declarations about it, that inner hell, stemming from varied focal lengths of the poet's own, and followed by a naked childlike cry, "Make it go away." Here, in the most appalling poem in his death book, is the whole exposure of Hammonds' it, his terrifying burn center. I'm largely a big joke. If somebody else doesn't make a crack about me, I do. The burn center in me is too steady a place to dwell in. I go by there, throw rocks, and laugh my head off when the windows splinter. Kaplooey! What kind of little nerd is doing a little serious reading in there? And is this a library? Then I roar. All that faked up type lying shells like boot camp drills. What does it have to do with anything? Did I take my bristled nest of humiliations to heart? What kind of dunce keeps a fire going like this? What do people mean coming to hell to warm themselves? Well, it is warm. The fire, stoked by whatever, is truly burning. So that's the way I am. I just can't keep it straight. People melt down in the heat sometimes and weep. I just don't know what to do. I just jumpstart my pickup and drive off. I just declare to goodness. But I know something about burning myself. Better laugh it off. Better not believe it. Better not think it's real. It's not real. It's so cool. Actually, it's nothing. It's just nothing. Crack it up. Make it go away. Hammonds' skill in making these poems unquotable except in holes is evident here, as in other poems in this book. Depending on the focal length, extending from irony to non-irony, with which you regard your own misfit, hurting, anomalous self, you see yourself as a big joke or as a source of weeping. The reader has to pursue the aghast humiliations of the poem to the very end to experience the click of its wholeness, make it go away. Over and over here, Hammonds asks what truths, if any, will stand up to inspection, what motives, if any, will become visible, what words, if any, will grant clarification. Balked, he remarks in Rogue Elephant, one of the funniest remarks. No wonder the great sayers who say nothing sit about in inaccessible states of mind. Just a short step up from saying nothing, Hammonds implies, is saying the minimal. But at this point, the minimal has to be done cursively, not epigrammatically as it was done in briefings. Hammonds opens the poem called Tree Limbs Down with himself having gone to the mall, unwillingly perhaps, but willing to go along. He opens it with himself in the mall halls, experiencing a flurry of thoughts on having, wanting, everything, anything, and nothing, feeling the oppressiveness of what Stevens memorably called, in chaos in motion and not in motion, desire without an object of desire. The poverty of having everything is not wanting anything. I trudge down the mall halls and see nothing wanting, which would pick me up. Recalling the urgent immediacy of appetite in his youthful poverty, Hammonds recalls dryly that lining the outside of immediacy, alas, is uncertainty. So the costly part of the crust of morning bread is not knowing it will be there. It has been said by others, though few, Hammonds continues, quoting Emerson, that nothing is got for nothing. It's in Emerson's essay on self-conduct. Nothing is got for nothing, he says in the mall hall, so I am reconciled. I traipse my dull self down the aisles of desire and settle for nothing. Nothing wanted, nothing spent, nothing got. Nothing, 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 zero, 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 a maximal counting of the minimum. It is actually reading this book endlessly entertaining, seeing Hammonds' ingenuity in heaping up a huge pile of his wry nothings. But Bosch and Flapdoodle cannot forbear to include, besides its zeros, occasional acute memories of the past, of which the most touching is Hammonds' recollection of one childhood Christmas. Yet such stories, he says at this stage in his life, are too old to save, because they are not happening now. They are not participating in his current expressing of longevity's awful tedium. I remember, he says in this brief reminiscence, I remember an ancient Christmas morning with my tin toy mule and milk wagon on the quilt. I was 4, and that little thing tied a world together. It was a miracle, but that is a story too old to save. So in spite of the pull of memory, and the recollection of early deprivation. And in spite of childhood's susceptibility to miracles, Hammonds must return to the present, permitting only such brief glimpses of the remote past. One of those glimpses, the memory of a sexual erection, occurs in Good God, the poem on impotence, with which I conclude, where the poet allows a tantalizingly warm recollection and rendition of erection. Good God, when I first read it, seemed miraculous in its humor, its tenderness, its amusement at the body's phenomena of arousal, but equally miraculous in its freedom to express rueful sorrow at the dissipation of desire, and to give a comically pragmatic account of contemporary remedies. Here is Good God, with its minimalism of impotence and its maximalism of erection, as the poem goes up with potency, down with impotence. In Good God, along with you know and say, as you've heard said, so to speak, interpolations which construct the poet's mask of offhand orality, the imitation of speech, we find deliberate traces of intellectuality in a phrase such as a serviceable irony, and in the poet's sexual parody of Jesus' declaration in Matthew 26:41 that the spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. Impotence can be either biological or psychological or both. Yeats's old self is confidently sick with desire, but fastened to a dying animal. It has no psychological deficiency, only a physiological one. But Hammonds' impotence hovers between the slack spirit and the flagging flesh. Good God. It used to flick up so often I called it flicker. It's a very funny poem, hard poem. It used to flick up so often I called it flicker, but now, drooping, it nods awake, or, losing it, slips back asleep. I say, stand up there, man, but you know, it's only me, and it takes no threat to heart, so to speak. It's lazier than a sick dog that won't lift his head to sniff the wind. It has always amused me as a serviceable irony that the spirit, which is without substance, can move the flesh. A thought, a sight, a scent. Freezing the wires of the mind sounds like substance. And the thing just reacts, warms, fills, lengthens, hardens without hands or lips, without touch. So we must think of the spirit as a matter of great force and be mindful that while it works wondrously. But later on in life, say, the spirit may be willing and the flesh weak, as you have heard said. You could suppose the spirit at that point not very willing, or it could come up with something. Or perhaps the thing, long asleep, has fallen out of use. We have seen the whole poem circling round the minimal word thing. Hammonds' euphemism for the penis, voiced with what sounds like an echo of teenage inability to use the actual anatomical word. Embarrassed, the poem says, the thing, the thing. The flicker that used to flick up but now droops, the head that can scarcely nod awake before it slips back to sleep, the sick dog that won't lift its head, the thing that won't come up or come without the spirit coming up with something, the head long asleep that has fallen out of use, this single body part that is named with the most general word in the language, thing, mobilizes even Jesus' sayings to its service. The poem's adult in quotes, attempt to step back from his problem, it has always amused me as a serviceable irony, is given up as the stimuli of memory begin to affect him. A thought, a sight, a scent, each individual stimulus separated by the final T, closing off each from the other. Hammonds forgets his present regret as the 5 unseparated verbs enact the remembered erection. The thing reacts, warms, fills, lengthens, hardens, without hands or lips. The minimalism here stems from the poem's being stuck on the single word thing. The maximum occurs The maximalism occurs in the 3 stimuli that can arouse it and the 5 verbs it takes to complete the erection. But then, realizing that the natural link joining one human body to another no longer operates reliably, if at all, the poet finds himself plunged into solitude by that day of radical separation, which anticipates the solitude of the grave. A realization that puts you back before the world began, alone. The walls of the grave your only embrace, and the soil you lie on, all that lies on you. We know this rhetoric, aye, but to die, and go we know where, to lie in cold obstruction, and to rot for measure for measure. And it's no wonder that Hammonds for a moment rejects his minimalism here in the grave, expands his diapason, and alludes to all graves, a fine and private place, but none I think do here embrace the walls of the grave your only embrace. He recovers immediately, however, and creates a flat monosyllabic minimal chiasmus, you lie on all that lies on you, turning his back on elusive poetic rhetoric and returning to his oral home vocabulary. My goodness. Fortunately, there are remedies, implants, injections, dirty magazines. The world is sometimes so well provided with second or third chances, we must be amazed at the thoughtfulness of so many applied to so wide a scope of possibility, and give the piss poor thing a chance. The tragedy of the grave's embrace is routed in an upbeat, assumed amazement at modern remedies for impotence. The list first sounds like a Latinate medical brochure. We can do implants, we can do injections, and then capsizes into a familiar home remedy, a means of arousal known since adolescence, dirty magazines. The whole world seems devoted to thinking up cures for impotence to the impotent man. The thoughtfulness of so many, says the poet with irony, at the expense of the surgical and pharmaceutical agents, mixed with unguarded, ironic cheer in the wide scope of possibility via the administrations. Perhaps the thing has a future after all. And the poet, coming down from the preposterous moral diction, the thoughtfulness of so many, to his ordinary language, encourages hope. Give the piss poor thing a chance. I could go on quoting wit from Bosch and Flapdoodle, such as Hammonds' version of the immemorial autumn poem taken so seriously through English literature, Fall Fell. So that's it for the leaf poetry. Or even better, his description of a childhood Thanksgiving dinner, which depends on your knowing that birds are descended from dinosaurs. So there we were, eating feathered dinosaur meat for Sunday dinner and expecting the return of Jesus Christ any minute. It's a very funny poem, too. Talks about the dinosaur biddies in it a little later. There is far more work to be done on Hammonds' lost poems, and on their cunning sonic alignments especially, but it seems to me already certain that many of these wonderfully funny, humane, grave, confessional, dry pieces will find a place in the anthologies. Not the school anthologies, of course. You can't put a good God in the school anthologies. Though they should. So funny. Defending his own maximizing of the minimal and criticizing poems of quote-unquote considered richness, Hammonds bursts out in genetic counseling. What's the matter with dirt? Dirt, and more dirt, and a little bit more. As he said in closing his poem about the uselessness of old men, at times, old men will look up at the world, raise an eyebrow, and smile a small smile hard to read. Because Hammonds smiles a small smile in these lyrics of the humiliations and failures of old age, his minima become maxima of originality in the genre of old age poetry.